titre fait référence à l'article très célèbre de Nicholas Cook de 2001 qui s'appelle Music and as Performance Between Process and Product. Aujourd'hui, je vais discuter la créativité musicale, ou bien, si vous voulez, les créativités au pluriel, parce qu'il y en a plusieurs dans la littérature qui développent maintenant. Ça se montre de plus en plus clairement et fréquemment. This presentation builds upon the work that we have been pursuing for the last 7 years in the United Kingdom, thanks to considerable funding from the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And what I'm going to do today is to start by reviewing the work of our previous centre, CHARM, the Centre for the History and Analysis of Recorded Music, and then tell you about our current centre, which AHRC has just described to you, the Research Centre for Musical Performance as Creative Practice. And as you will hear, this reference to creative practice is really the crucial thing. That will be the focus of my presentation today. We will then look at 2 projects in sequence, one from CHARM and one from CMPCP. Est-ce que tout le monde me comprend? Est-ce que vous préférez que je parle en français? Si vous n'entendez pas très bien en anglais, je peux le faire en français, comme vous voulez. L'anglais? Ça va ou non? Français, qui préfère le français? D'accord.
Okay.
I'm going to start though by just making very brief reference to some extracts from the literature on creativity, which I think will be useful in orientating our discussion. As we prepared to move from the previous centre, which as you'll hear was focused on recorded music, towards the new centre, which is focused on the study of live music, we felt it was necessary to grapple with the literature on creativity such as it is. But we were surprised that there was relatively little literature on musical creativity in particular, relatively little compared to the importance of the topic. So we set about forming 3 seminars, which were convened by John Sloboda, on musical creativity as training for us in preparing for this new centre. And I was asked to review the book that I'm going to show you in a minute by David Perkins. Here, before we begin, that is the website of CHARM, and you can see the address there. I'll show you the address again at the end. And just before I get into this, you'll see that there's a list here of the different activities that we were engaged in, including 4 research projects on different topics, one of which I will describe shortly. There's quite a lot of material on this website which you can get hold of, a lot of recorded material, as well as a very sizable discography. One of the main things that CHARM was trying to do was to make resources available for people to do research on recorded music. The new centre is quite different in aims and structure, and I'm going to tell you more about that in a minute, but again, here is the web address, which we'll see again at the end of the session. Now, this literature on creativity is fascinating, if somewhat problematic for reasons which I will discuss. In this book, which I was asked to review for our creativity seminars, this book by David Perkins, we read the following. How a person has captured the insight and conjured the energy to paint a masterpiece, devise a revolutionary scientific theory, make music in a way that moves listeners down the ages, has been thought beyond reach of human understanding, stubbornly inscrutable, essentially ineffable. People have been reluctant to touch upon this, saying that Beethoven was a great genius and we cannot, as mere mortals, understand how he created his great masterpieces. Yet, David Perkins continues, creating in the arts and sciences is a natural, comprehensible extension and orchestration of ordinary, everyday abilities of perception, understanding, memory, and so on. Many significant insights can be explained as occurring in essentially the same way, by means of essentially the same psychological mechanisms as the ordinary, everyday act of understanding a Woody Allen joke. This has got to be seen as somewhat facetious, equating Beethoven's Ninth Symphony with a Woody Allen joke. It's interesting nevertheless. You'll note the date, 1981, and this was part of an attempt, if you like, to convince us all that we had genius within us, each and every one of us. There was the potential for genius. Perkins continues, the extraordinary, if not specifically creative abilities involved in extraordinary creating are not different in kind, and this is the point of his book. They can be understood as exceptional versions of familiar mental operations such as remembering, understanding, and recognizing. They are more of the same. Creativity has to be understood as the combination of traits which fosters the creative use of that more of the same. Now, an interesting distinction can be found in the work of Margaret Bowden in her book, The Creative Mind, published in 2004, where she says, creativity enters into virtually every aspect of life. It's not a special faculty, but an aspect of human intelligence in general, echoing what Perkins said. In other words, it's grounded in everyday abilities such as conceptual thinking, perception, memory, and reflective self-criticism. So it isn't confined to a tiny elite. Every one of us is creative to a degree. This is a fascinating quotation, not least because of its reference to an elite. I edited a chapter in 1995 by Anders Ericsson and Ralph Cramper, in which they distinguish between expert performance on the one hand and elite performance on the other. And I remember asking them, as this chapter was evolving, how they distinguish between the two, and really what allowed one to achieve this level of elite performance. And they could not explain. They were able to define what it was, but not how it was achieved. And it is really that kind of relationship that we're exploring in our centre, but not only that, as you see. Bowden continues, there is a distinction, she says, between psychological creativity, as she calls it, and historical creativity. And she uses these descriptors P creativity and H creativity for short. These are perfectly awful descriptions. I hate them, but they're useful. P creativity, she says, involves coming up with a surprising, valuable idea that is new to the person who comes up with it. It doesn't matter how many people have had that idea before, but if a new idea is H creative, that means that, so far as we know, no one else has had it before. It has arisen for the first time in human history. And this is a useful distinction, if somewhat problematic distinction, between what might be called creativity on the one hand and originality on the other. Or, if you prefer, between originality on the one hand and creativity on the other. There's a lot of confusion about these, and one of the projects in our centre under my own direction is looking at just this issue in the context of teaching practices. How it is that an individual voice in performance is fostered by performance teachers. So turning now to the centre, let's get a sense of the background to the work that's now going on. And I'm picking up from where Daniel Pistone left off, also conducting a bit of an historical survey of musicology as it used to be and to some extent still is. This was a musicology opposed to performance, if you like, or at least in which performance was seen as somewhat suspicious and often inferior. It was composer-centered, work-focused, and score-based. It saw music as a literature rather than a performing art, and the job of a performer was to recreate the work as originally conceived by the composer. This notion endures quite considerably, not only amongst the musicological communities, but surprisingly in performance communities. Recently we had a workshop in Cambridge, where, I won't say who it was, but a very, very notable leading pianist said that basically her job, as she saw it, was to convey the composer's intentions, and that was the end of it. We had a long discussion about this, and I didn't believe that she was being truly honest with herself or with us, but it's still an enduring notion. As an example, I've got this quote from Schenker, 1911, in his unfinished book writing on performance. A thorough knowledge of all laws of composition, this notion of law is of course significant, will enable the performer to recreate the composition. That, in essence, is the goal of the performer, to recreate the composition, as opposed to what we're arguing, to create something new. Our argument is that each performer not simply a recreation. Some of the developments in recent years that have changed thinking within musicology include the focus on a much broader range of musics, the rise of ethnomusicology, and the rise of a discipline or an area of musicology called performance studies. Now, in 1995, in his book, Performing Music Shared, Jonathan Dunsby talked about performance studies as a discipline as it was taking shape at the time. And he pointed out, among other things, if we're now trying to get a sense of the state of play in this field, that it was a fragmented activity. It was too atomized, too spread out, not consolidated enough. I think things have changed, as we'll see, as that was certainly the case 15 years ago. The focus tended to be narrow, Western classical music, particularly piano music, normally played by men, as it happens. A lack of methodological synthesis, a lack of shared discourse, which remains a problem, particularly between performers on the one hand and scholarly communities on the other. How one can achieve true communication between the two remains problematic. A lack of common purpose and understanding, a lack of engagement with practitioners. There was a tendency for the academic community to regard performers as rats in a cage, and they were observed with a clipboard, but that was about it. There was no real communication with performers themselves. And there was also a controversy about practice-led research, whether research based in and focused on practice was as valuable as some of the older forms of musicology that Daniel's done, referred to the study of texts, for instance, which she talked about earlier on. So we set up this new centre, which began in October last year, October 2009, and its aims are summarised here. Charm's work on recordings serves as the springboard for an enterprising and coordinated study of live musical performance. The Centre for Musical Performance as creative practice will combine empirical, analytical, and computational approaches to performance from diverse traditions and cultures in an effort to shape or help to shape musicology's future agenda. That's what we said. This was the executive summary. This is our policy document that we published, so you must forgive the kind of language used here, but you'll get a sense of what we were and are aiming to do. To contrast the two centres, which together comprise 10 years of funded research, thanks to the support of the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which, like every other body in the United Kingdom and probably in the world, is suffering from severe financial constraints at the moment. So we've been very fortunate to have as much as £3 million to devote to the study of musical performance, which is, of course, a very considerable amount of money, which probably would not be found now. Charm focuses, as I said, on recorded music, whereas we in our new centre focus on live music making. And the making of music is an important notion in this context. Secondly, Charm studied performance through its products, the recordings, whereas we're focusing on performance as a process, as a creative practice, as an act, or potentially better put, a series of acts spread over time. Performance, not single act at all, but something that's spread over time. Whereas we focused on Western art music before, we've broadened the focus to include popular music and global music. One of our main focus points in the conference that will be taking place next summer, for instance, is jazz, which I think is a very good thing. The Charm Centre produced this discography. I mentioned 4 projects and a series of 6 specialist seminars, which were focused on specific topics, whereas in the new centre we have 5 projects, which are slightly different in ambition. We've got PhD students working with us thanks to funding from the Research Council, a series of visiting fellowships where people can come to us and share their own work with us. Workshop packages attached to each of the projects so that there's an awful lot of opportunity for dialogue between scholars and performers who are coming together. And this Performance Studies Network, details of which are found on our website. You can join. We've got about 440 members in the network, in this forum that we are running. How many people are members of the Performance Studies Network forum? I know Zay is, Jonathan is. If you're not, I would encourage you to join. It's free of charge. You don't get that much either, so it's not a nuisance. The structure is as follows. Cambridge is the host institution, and Nicholas Cook and I are based there. Our partner institutions, as Elia said, are King's College London, Oxford University and Royal Holloway, and the two associated institutions, the Royal College of Music and the Guildhall School of Music and Drama. It's very important, we think, that these two institutions are included in the framework of the program so that there's a grounding in performance reality at all times. Our projects are shown here. The first, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, is called Shaping Music and Performance, based at King's College London. And that's looking at how musicians visualize the notion of musical shape, which is a term that doesn't really translate terribly well into French, as we'll hear. But I'm going to talk about that in a minute. My own project, Creative Learning and Original Music Performance, looks at the teaching studio and the broader educational environment in the Royal College of Music and the Guildhall School of Music and Drama to see how, as I said before, a creative voice is developed through teaching, at what stage and how. It's very interesting in our workshop some weeks ago to hear some teachers say the most important thing in finding the voice is the personality. One must have a strong sense of self-identity as a performer in order to have a voice. Another teacher said, the individual voice doesn't matter. What matters first of all is technique. If you don't have technique, you cannot develop a voice. This was an opera singer whom I've just seen perform on the stage of the Royal Opera House. There was a very interesting thing to say because, of course, singing involves so much individual personality. But she said, without that foundation, without that bedrock, you will not be able to excel as an elite performer, if you will, which is a very interesting point. The next project, Creative Practice in Contemporary Concert Music, studies the relationship between performers and composers of new music. We're commissioning new works, and the performers will work with the composers to bring out new performances and together, if you like, collaboratively create new music in performance. Global Perspectives on the Orchestra looks at large ensembles and in particular how a collective interpretation is reached. So both of these projects focus on what might be termed collective creativity, sometimes called distributed creativity in the literature. So not a single person's creativity, but a process involving multiple participants. And finally, Nicholas Cook's book, Music as Creative Practice, will encompass all different aspects of music and musical creativity, drawing upon the results of our projects. So what are we trying to do? Well, first of all, to consolidate national and international performance studies research and thus work against this fragmentation and this lack of consolidation that I referred to before. Secondly, to develop research capacity and capability in terms of new knowledge, new skills and methodologies, and new resources. So, for instance, in terms of publications, there will be 5 books coming out of this centre, in addition to a very considerable web resource with workshop reports, as well as some software with respect to musical shape. Thirdly, to foster engagement through our workshops, our network, our fellowships, collaborations and so forth, as well as other events that we're running. And we're bringing Alfred Brendel to Cambridge in May, thanks to donors' funding, and there'll be the opportunity to engage with him if he allows us. We'll see how it goes. I think he's got a particular program in mind. To encourage the exchange of knowledge, insight and understanding, as I've said, and finally, to address fundamental questions about creativity relevant, we think, to all of us. And these questions are as follows. In what ways are performers creative? Now, bear in mind that for many, many generations, performers were not thought to be creative at all. They simply did the job of the composer, and of course the famous quotes by Stravinsky, possibly by Schoenberg, which support that notion. The attribution to Schoenberg, as Jonathan will tell us, is arguable. Secondly, how does the creative activity of performers vary across different cultures, idioms, and conditions? It's very dangerous to collapse all performance activity into one notion because of this huge breadth that exists. And thirdly, how do musical performances take shape over time through the exercise of individual and collective creativity. And in English, this notion of taking shape is a particularly rich one. It could be understood both figuratively and literally. I'm not sure that there's really a corresponding notion in French which has quite so many implications. How it... Qu'est-ce qu'on dit alors? Comment ça... Comment ça prend forme? Est-ce que ça se dit? Ça se dit, mais c'est dans cet aspect que ça se dit. Mais,
comment ça prend vie?
Prend vie, oui. Mais aussi, la notion qu'on va voir de shape, il y a un aspect de trois dimensions, c'est-à-dire l'aspect spatial, de l'architecture. So let's look at one of the projects. I'm grateful to my colleagues here. We've just appointed a new research associate, but he hasn't signed the contract, so I can't tell you who it is. If you come back in a few weeks, you'll find the name of the person on our site. This project, Shaping Music in Performance, is looking at this notion of shape, which continually comes up in discussions amongst musicians. So you have a number of musicians playing, say, a quartet, or a teacher, say, with a student. Somebody might say, I don't like the way you're shaping that phrase. This doesn't have a very good shape to it. I don't really like the shape of his performance, or the shape of her line, or whatever. We'll talk more about what that might mean. And in fact, these colleagues are investigating that based upon these key questions. So, do performing musicians use the idea of shape or shape in music? And how do they use these ideas if they do so? Do the ways in which these ideas are used differ between different musicians? Which aspects of music generate a sense of shape? And what mechanisms underlie the music-shape association? Now, Daniel Leach Wilkinson, the project director, and the two research assistants and the PhD student are exploring these questions in a number of different ways. Their belief, along with my own and that of many of us, is that shape really does matter, simply because of its currency in dialogue. And one of the ways in which they explored this was through a questionnaire sent out online, which I'm going to discuss in a minute. But it was amazing how many people came back in response to this questionnaire using this term, or describing other phenomena in ways that could be understood in terms of this elusive notion of shape. So what they've done is to compile documentary evidence where available, to conduct a questionnaire study, which I'll describe. They're pursuing an interview study with key performers, identified in the questionnaire study, and then a number of experiments, as well as finally a synthetical account of theoretical approaches. The documentary evidence that they've looked at is drawn from composers, musicologists, critics, performers, and choreographers as well, both written and audiovisual materials. And their findings are, as we see here, spontaneous references to the term shape and the idea of shape. This notion of spontaneous is important because they've not been invited. It's there in any case. There's a link between music and movement, which is fundamental, a link between shape and musical form or structure, and also the use of the term shape in relation to expression. And I think that these three main categories are the ones that I'd like to stress: movement, form, structure, and expression. As we'll see in a minute, these recur time and time again in the questionnaire study as well. Now, the questionnaire study involved 370 people who began, and 231 who ended up completing the questionnaire, which was quite long, so 62% or so. The largest age group, 25 to 34 years. This is the age distribution of people who started the questionnaire and who completed it. So this age group here, as you can see, is the most prominent. They tried to identify the status of each of the participants in the questionnaire according to this breakdown. So at the top, an amateur intermediate level performer who does not make much of the person's income from performance. And they draw this distinction between amateur and professional, not in terms of ability, but in terms of economics. You may have an amateur who's an absolutely superb performer, but simply who does not make much of his or her living from performance, as against a professional who may be not all that good, who knows, but who does earn the money from performance. Secondly, an amateur professional standard performer, this is the one I've just been referring to, but you're a highly capable player even if you're not actually professional, because a very low amount of income derives from performance. Thirdly, a professional performer, a substantial part of your income comes from performing activities. And then they also had two different categories of teacher, teaching mostly beginners or intermediate level, and a teacher teaching mostly advanced pupils. And you can see the breakdown there. It's not terribly interesting, but it's worth knowing that they did this. This was the breakdown by groups: keyboard, strings, wind, brass, percussion, conducting, voice, other, and then undisclosed, which may be because they play multiple instruments. You can see that in terms of the percentage dropout, conductors were very, very unwilling to complete the survey, the questionnaire. They were the worst in terms of completing it for whatever reason. This was the years of experience and so forth. In terms of classical, non-classical, or both, that was the distribution. So mostly classical, but quite a lot of people who crossed over. The distribution of respondents here, and you can see that France is well represented, which I'm pleased to see, between 6 and 11 people. Most respondents were in the Anglo-Saxon world, which is not surprising. Now, the emerging things which I've already alluded to are that shape could be understood as musical structure, or structure in music as performed. It can be used or understood as a tool for expressive performance, a tool for realizing musical structure in an expressive way. And then there were various narrative-related uses of shape. Sometimes this occurred in context to do with improvisation, also used in private, but also with others in dialogue, as I've said. Here are some citations, which we're not going to look at in detail, but there are two passages in particular. This piece of Bernstein had a different shape to the other piece in question, and also a different sense. Here one had technically difficult shapes to finger, so that would simply mean figuration. And to remember, while the other piece demanded long breaths to keep the shape and flow of the lyrical song line. So here at the level of structure, here at the level of figuration, and here in the context of the line. Three different uses in one person's citation. In this passage, structure translates into shape. Well, what is the actual distinction between the two? And then this person goes on, there is the element of gesture, and we talked a minute ago about gesture, and this allows you to identify, in a less abstract way, with the music. There were hundreds of these responses, which clearly we're not going to go over. But what did emerge was a huge range of possible definitions emerged to do with these different elements. This is the breakdown. One interesting thing to note here is that certain instrumental groups or vocalists tended to gravitate towards different uses of the term. That, I think, is really quite significant. In my own informal exploratory work with different performers, I've discussed how music feels to performers, and because I'm a pianist, I have a very strong sense of spatiality. Talking to a very distinguished violinist friend, this person has a sense of musical shape as moving in and out, rather like the arms moving in and out, a sense of breathing coming from wind players and so forth. And these terms, to some extent, capture this physical origins, physical provenance of music on the part of individual performers. Now, we're not going to try to get into finding an alternative word to shape in French. It's difficult enough with the word performance, as we've heard. Shape is very, very difficult to capture, but I hope this gives you a sense of where we're starting from. What I'm going to do now is to model musical shape, building upon some of my own work, which I won't talk about in detail now, but in fact I've been preoccupied with this notion of shape for some 30 years, ever since my undergraduate contact with Edward Cohn at Princeton, who wrote about musical shape in his 1968 book, Musical Form and Musical Performance. And I presented some of this work, which was in development at a conference honouring Edward Cohen 2 years ago, which Jonathan Dunsby also attended. Now we've just about published this work, so it's coming up to fruition. You'll be able to access it quite soon. But the notion of model here is interesting from a number of different standpoints. First of all, it's interesting to get a sense of what people think with regard to shape, but how can it properly be understood? At the level of a line or at the level of an entire piece? How can we actually model musical shape over time? There's a second aspect here, and I brought along one more quote from David Perkins, and this, remember, is a book about creative acts. He says, schemata play a paradoxical role in discovery, making possible discovery and fluency within their scope, inhibiting discovery beyond their scope, but at the same time preparing the way for such discovery by establishing a context against which anomalies, and in general, alternatives, become meaningful. This is a somewhat difficult quote to understand at sight, but it's an important one. This notion of schemata, the schema, the underlying model, which guides creativity. So the basis of creativity, to some extent, is, if you like, a model, or a set of models that will be developed over time. And I would argue that in performance, one aspect of this creativity in performance is the use of underlying models which are defined and refined over time on the part of the individual performer or the body of performers, but a model which is terribly difficult to conceptualize and to make real in description or in verbal representation. And what I'm going to try to do now, building upon the work that I did in my Charm project some years ago, is to show you one example of musical shape as modeled in the context of 3 different performers. Now this project evolved between 2006 and 2009. It was called Analyzing Motive in Performance, and it involved not only myself, but Netta Spiro and Nicholas Gold, Royal Holloway, and King's College London. This was before I moved to Cambridge. I defined performance motive, which was the focus of this project, as expressive patterns within performances which function motivically therein. And I remember back when I was a master's student, studying under Jonathan Dunsby 31 years ago, which is an alarming thought, being very frustrated by some of the work that I was reading about musical motive, not least the work of Rudolf Reti, Systematic Process in Music, where musical motives were rather arbitrarily selected from the music, and there was this sense that Beethoven or Brahms or whoever, Schumann, whoever it was, had some sort of sense of these motives linking together to form a unity. And this was a basis of value and quality in music, the fact that these 3 notes and these 3 notes and these 3 notes were the same. Now, I was very frustrated by this because the selection seemed arbitrary, as I said, and I could not really understand how that connection necessarily had anything to do with good music. An example of motivic saturation leading to bad music is Chopin's early sonata, Opus 4, where he was developing his compositional technique. If you look at the first movement, it's an essay in motivic unity, but it's, if you want my opinion, a really rather bad piece of music. So motivic unity does not guarantee or necessarily affect quality. What I tried to do in this project was to find a counterpart for the notion of motive as a pitch construction or configuration, or a rhythmic or harmonic configuration. I tried to understand the notion of motive in terms of expressive patterns, so defined in terms of parameters which meant something to performers, or which mean something in performance. So performance motives, to continue, involve performative parameters such as timing, dynamics, articulation, timbre, etc. These are things that change over time in performance. They may or may not be linked to specific pitch, rhythmic or harmonic configurations, in other words, conventional musical motives. They may be manipulated according to performers' expressive strategies, consciously manipulated, or probably more likely unconsciously, or both. And finally, they may enhance or affect a sense of coherence in given performances. Coherence in the sense of cohering, of working as a whole, and coherence in the sense of comprehensibility. Je crois qu'en français on dit cohérence dans les deux sens, n'est-ce pas? Évidemment, cohérence compréhension, mais les deux. So what we did in our project was to conduct traditional motivic analysis based on the score. So this is old-fashioned analysis of motive. Secondly, we determined and then analyzed performance motives in contrasting recordings using different techniques such as self-organizing maps, I'll show you in a minute, formal component analysis, etc. This is where my assistants did the hard work because I was not able to do this very technologically complex work, but we collaborated on it. Then we asked listeners to identify prominent features, prominent expressive features, including these motives in the recordings, and then finally compared the results. The point here is that we started in the traditional way of doing analysis, was we started with the score. Whereas in the second category, this is the new work, we started with the performances. That's a crucial difference. Much work in the field of performance analysis still is score focused. And what we really need to do is to focus on the properties of performances rather than on how performances represent scores. Now in the work I'm going to show you, I will look at the score, but it's really to give you a background, and that's it. We're going to study instead the performances themselves. So here's a kind of breakdown of a sort of undergraduate kind. This was not an undergraduate, this is my own work, not that of an undergraduate. This is a Chopin Mazurka, Opus 24, number 2. And so you can see that it's in a broad Channery form. There's the middle section and then it returns. This first part is itself an ABA, the contrasting middle section here, and there are two parts to the so-called trio section. The reprise is a short version of this. So a broad first section, a middle section, and then the return. But interestingly, with an introduction, at the end of this broad first section, codetta, and then at the end of the piece, a coda, which links to the material at the beginning, also referring in a sense to this codetta. There's Chopin's manuscript showing the beginning of the introduction, marked sotto voce, with a metronome marking which was not respected in the first editions because the German first edition, which was the basis of the French and English first editions, copied out the metronome marking for number 1 of the step, not number 2. So in the printed editions it says quarter note of crotchet equals 108, not 192, so much slower. That's wrong. You can see this clearly marked here. You'll hear this in a minute. The A section focused on this melody, beginning in A minor, but moving to the tonic C major eventually in the second part of the section. The B section, this mazur-like melody, very typical arch-shaped melody, typical of the mazur, one of the different mazurka types, with a waltz-like accompaniment here. Notice in this passage here, the third phrase, the marking rubato, which is one of the last times Chopin used this marking rubato in his scores. Of course, he was famous for his rubato, but rarely marked it at all, and never after Opus 25. In the trio section, we move to D flat major, with a somewhat more boisterous section, or energetic section, with again a mazur-like arch-shaped melody, and then a more plaintive, melancholy section here, D, more criada-like, before we eventually return, as I said there. In the coda, in the final phrase, the German, French, and English first editions are rather different because Chopin introduced variants in the French and English which are not found in the German, which, as I said, was the basis of the French and English. He sent his manuscript that we saw to Leipzig, and proofs were produced, and then sent to France for Chopin to correct. The proofs were used as the basis of the French edition and the English, which is why these are somewhat different in the text. And interestingly, when you listen to different recordings of this mazurka, you can determine to some extent which editions the performers were using based on whether or not they play variants such as these. Now, we started our performance analysis by looking at timing data. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this technique of tapping to a CD as it plays, and as you tap, the computer registers where you have put the downbeat, if it's a downbeat, or the level of the beat, where you have marked the beat. How many of you have ever tapped to determine the tempo fluctuation? Has anyone done this? Well, a few of you. I'll tell you this, it's actually very tricky to do. I don't know if this was your experience. It's actually very difficult to do this accurately because you anticipate the beat, or you're thinking, oh gosh, that was a little bit quicker than I thought, so you're behind the beat. And thanks to a couple of different softwares, including Sonic Visualizer, it is possible to take the raw data and clean it up so that your beats are absolutely marked in the right place according to where the performers in question have tapped the beat. So these are reliable data based upon tapped data in the first instance, but which were then cleaned using Sonic Visualizer. Now this gives you it's actually a very attractive graph prepared by my colleague Netta Spira. It gives you a very approximate sense of how 29 different performances look in terms of tempo fluctuation, but there's not a lot of help in terms of the specificity. We wanted to compare performances, so we developed another technique using this method called self-organizing maps. And what this does is to take the lengths of beats determined through tapping. So there's beat 1, beat 2, beat 3 in bar 1, 2, 3, and 4, so forth in this particular performance. And then the software looks for commonalities across 3 beats in a row. You can define this as however you like. But for instance, if there's a consistent pattern of, say, long, medium, short in bar 1 and in bar 16 and in bar 42, the software will identify that, and it then forms clusters, shown there and here. These are different clusters, so this is with 3 beat more or less the same. This is with a prominent second beat, and this is with a prominent third beat, ascending like that. So the software looks for these patterns, clusters them like that, and then the most important thing is to go back and conduct an analysis, possibly with reference to the score, but not starting with the score, as I said. The score is used as a reference point only, but not as the validator of performance integrity, or not. This is all done automatically. Once you have the tap data and you feed it through the system, it's all produced automatically, so no interference with the person doing the analysis in terms of decision making. It's knowledge-free, bottom-up. Now, across the 29 performances that we looked at, in fact, we started with about 45 performances, from which I isolated the ones I considered most interesting, about 29. Most interesting doesn't mean that I liked them, I sometimes hated them, but they were interesting for whatever reason. And we found 4 main clusters in terms of the relative beat length. So cluster 1 was 3 largely similar beats. So this is the first beat in the bar in proportion to the second and third beats. So you can see there's a slightly lower third beat. Here, a very prominent second beat with a shorter first beat. This is a very prominent downbeat. And then finally, a prominent third beat. And in a mazurka, you would expect to find prominent third beats and second beats because of the typical accentual patterns. Now this still is not detailed enough. 29 performances would tend to regress towards the mean. So again, we want to look at specific performances and then compare them. And what we're going to do is look at 3 in particular. Look at the full range here, first of all. This is the 29 performances, and you can see the emphasis on the second beats here. The 3 case studies we're going to look at are Rubinstein 1939, Magalov 1977, and Chu 1999. You can see that Rubinstein has a great deal more second beat emphasis than Chu. this is just by way of background. Rubinstein's 3 recordings shown here have a great deal of second beat accent, gravitating here almost, well, between 40 and 50% of his beats are, second beats are stressed, as against third beats, where Rubinstein is clustered right at the end here, very little third beat accent. And it's interesting because many Polish scholars, many sopran scholars in Poland think that there is a correct way to play the mazurka and that only Poles can play mazurkas. And I can tell you, having studied, at least in this case, some 40, whatever it was, recordings, that there is absolutely no guarantee that if you are Polish, you're going to play the mazurka in the same way. It's all over the place. So we have Rubinstein here as against, at this end, whereas Pobocka is there, for instance. There are other Poles scattered around. Luszczak there, I think, is a Pole, and so forth. There's no consistent way, which is not really what one would expect. Now, this is the data that emerges from, the set of data that emerges from Frederick Chu's recording in 1999. Chu's performance can be understood by this technology in terms of 3 clusters. So largely flat, undifferentiated first, second, and third beats in terms of timing, a second beat emphasis, and a prominent third beat emphasis. I'm going to play this recording, and you'll hear it for yourself. What this graph shows is the 3 different clusters, blue, red, and white, and you can see there's a great deal of blue there, and a great deal of blue there, and so forth. So it's pretty chromatically unvaried, and you'll hear that in the sense the performance is also temporally unvaried. That's the whole point. Remember that this is done by the machine, if you like, rather than by anybody telling the machine what to do. Once you set it up, it just does this. The second thing to say, and this is an important one, this is not a complete analysis. This is looking only at timing. But for reasons which I'll explain in a minute, this is a particularly important parameter in the case of one of the performances we'll be looking at. So let's listen now. It's going. Come on. Come to life.
Slept.
Where's the... There it is. Notice that the clusters here do not respect tempo differentiation. You could have a slow bar and a fast bar which have the same relationship between the beats. So as I said, this is not a complete analysis, but it makes perfect sense that one, as a performer, would have in one's mind a characteristic set of approaches to temporal shaping within a bar. And for the mazurka, it's particularly important at the bar level, because that, in terms of Polish folk traditions, is how the rubato would be defined, at the level of the bar with fluctuation within, if you like, second and third beat deformations, by way of example. Now, that, I think you probably would agree, was a pretty flat performance. There was not a lot of variety in the temporal shaping. Compare that with Nikita Magalov, shown here. Now again, the machine is doing the work here, and the machine, the computer, has identified 18 different clusters, 18 distinguishable patterns of temporal shaping in the bar. Some of them will be very similar. So for instance, C11 is really quite similar to C12, with the second beat accent being prominent and the third beat accent being more prominent than the first. But the machine recognizes these as distinct. Now, if you look at this really rather colorful diagram here, you can get a sense from the different clusters shown here that there is a great deal of variety. I think we have probably enough time to say that if I take 10 more minutes, is that all right? Because you said up till 11:30, is that all right? Let's listen to Magalov now. And what I would like you to do, I don't know why this, what I'd like you to do is to imagine this as a dance piece. Of course, Chopin wrote that his mazurkas were not meant for dancing, so it's not literally meant to be danced to, but imagine it and see what you make of it in your imagination. This is a controversial recording amongst me and some of my friends. We've discussed this, and I personally find and have found this to be very disconcerting. I find it sort of like this. It keeps moving in different ways, and I don't know quite what it's doing. Now that I've listened to this something like 300 times, I'm able to anticipate it. It doesn't sound so strange. Other colleagues of mine, some musicians whose opinion I value very highly, say, what a fresh and improvisatory approach. This is so creative and so forth, and I think, no, not for me. But of course, on repeated hearings, as I said, the logic of it starts to come out a little more clearly, partly involving dynamics. You can hear the articulation of the bass, for instance, that Magaloff practices. Anyway, let's move on now to one more performance, which happens to be the first that I listened to of the 46 or 7. This is Arthur Rubinstein, whose performance is understood by the self-organizing map technology in terms of 8 clusters. And you can see here the second beat, second beat, second beat, second beat, and again second beat emphasis. Hence, we saw before that high level of second beat emphasis in terms of accent. It's interesting that Daniel Piston talked about des tas de l'interprétation et l'accent, et je vous discutais exactement ce sujet ici. We have one first beat stress there, and also, and only a single third beat stress cluster. Let's listen now to this performance, which you can see has a great deal of chromatic variety, but less so than Magaloff, as you would expect, with somewhat fewer clusters. Now let's try to get a sense of how Rubinstein creates a piece out of the notes on the score, or to put it a different way, what happens in performance that is actually a coherent musical statement or not a coherent musical statement. We'll start with the performance rather than the score. Here are the second and first beat, sorry, the third and first beat accents in the piece. I've depicted the third beat accents with this green arrow, Lewis green, and these are first beat accents, and these darker arrows are the blue cluster over here, C7, which is a very, very prominent first beat accent. Now, what I've done here is to remove the third beat accents and all first beat accents unless they fall on the first bar of a hypermeasure. So this is the first bar of each 4-bar group, each 4-bar hypermeasure. And you can see that Rubinstein stresses the first beat in each of the 4-bar groups. So for instance, this is C3, that's the stress that you get there, and then the darker ones, as I said, C7. Now this is 23 out of 30 4-bar phrases in the piece. This is, in one sense, only to be expected. How do you define the beginning of a phrase? You stress the first beat. So this is logical enough, but as we heard in Magalov, this is not necessarily to be assumed. It's not defined by the score. Where does it come from? Well, it's part of Rubinstein's particular performance approach. Let's go a little further with this. A second aspect of his performance approach concerns the middle section. Here we see, in the case of Magalov's performance, the different cluster types shown in colors here. And there's relatively little repetition across the 4-bar phrases of this C section. This is section C. You can see there in the 4th beat the same cluster used. And here C5, and there we have that. Otherwise, it's difficult to see a lot of pattern. C11 there. Okay, fine. In the case of Chu, we see many fewer clusters, as we would expect, and there is some repetition. He tends to end the phrase with a 3rd beat accent, although not here, possibly because he's leading on to the D section. He also stresses the 3rd beats at the beginnings of these 4-bar units, except for here, and the purple in the middle. But there's less consistency. What is remarkable is to find in Rubinstein's performance, which is so fluctuant and so alive, this should be 1939 by the way, so fluctuant and alive, a remarkable consistency. This 4-bar group is identical to the 3rd phrase, and the second 4-bar phrase, which is musically identical to this one, is also in Rubinstein's performance temporally identical in terms of these beat proportions within the bar. And not only are there identities like that, but they're very similar in all cases. So here we have a 2nd beat accent as here, but a little bit less prominent in relation to the 3rd beat than the 4th. Similar principle, perhaps, in Rubinstein. He's ending the 8-bar groups with a little bit more emphasis on the 3rd beat, rather like we found there, and rather like we found in Magalov. But this consistency in a piece as performed by Rubinstein that is so fresh and alive, so much fluctuation, particularly between the hands, is remarkable. Let's go a little bit further. Here's the graph that we've just looked at. Now, let's add to it the specific beat-by-beat data. So this is now showing beat-by-beat fluctuation, and you can start to see some broad patterns. Here I've drawn trend lines, this green, red, blue, which is lower, the red again, and then it trails off, blue, and lower tempo, intermediate tempo trailing off, and then the highest tempo back at the reprise with the coda as green, but then trailing off. And these are the metronomic values, which statistically are reliable. I mean, statistics really don't come into it much when we hear performance. You can't hear music in terms of statistics, you hear what it does. But this statistical analysis does bear out 3 different tempo plateaus. So intermediate, fastest, slowest, fastest trailing off, slowest, medium, and so forth. And these tempos of 210, 210, and then here it's actually 209. Statistically, it's remarkably similar. So there must be some large-scale temporal logic, some sort of planning going on in Rubinstein's ear that allows him to play every single A section at the same tempo. That's remarkable. This is not necessarily to be assumed. Maybe everybody does it, but I don't think so. Now let's go a little bit further and put all of this together. What we're going to do now, again, I'm modeling shape in performance, I'm looking at temporal shape, and I'm going to argue that in Rubinstein's performance, the temporal logic has three main components. First of all, this set of tempo plateau. Imagine this as a performance sort of speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, and so forth. So read this across as well as in profile. So that's the kind of temporal foundation. Think of it as a gesture moving across the performance like this. A literal shape in space. Secondly, this articulation of the four-bar groupings through downbeat stress, which provides a kind of series of points of articulation within this broad sweep. So broad sweep, but with points of articulation which define logical units, as well as leaving some undefined, which is itself significant. But then thirdly, the third element of this temporal shape, the temporal logic, is the middle section's regularity. And because it is regular, it allows us to hear what comes before as somewhat irregular in terms of the fluctuation within the bar, and it allows us to hear what follows as somewhat irregular in terms of fluctuation within the bar. So there's a gravitational element, or a gravitating out. So think of this again as gesture. Broad sweeps, downbeats, and sweeping out. And you have a sense of these things working together as forming the temporal shape of Rubinstein's performance. Is this a matter of realizing Chopin's intentions or bringing out the properties of the score? Well, maybe, maybe not. In a sense, who cares? Because what Rubinstein does is to create his own logical statement, if you like, which is a rather technical way of describing a very beautiful performance, but it helps us to understand what he's doing and how he creates something unique in this, as opposed to simply recreating what Chopin has defined in the score. So we come back to this notion of creativity here, a testament to the unique creative product in this performance. We come back to these three questions that guided us. In what way is a performance creative? How do musical performances take shape over time? And how does the creative activity of performers vary across different cultures, idioms, and conditions? What we really need to do, I think, is to study many, many more performances, both recorded and live, to get a sense of these individual logical conceptions, the individual ways in which creativity is manifested. And then at that point, we'll start to understand music as performance, and indeed musical creativity in performance, a great deal better. So thank you very much indeed.